The morning of October 14th, 1943 opened cold and clear over eastern England. At Thorpe, Abbotts, mechanics had been working through the darkness on the B-17 flying fortresses of the 306th Bomb Group, patching flak holes from the previous mission, pulling fouled spar plugs, splicing oxygen lines that had been crimped or torn by fragments on the last raid. By first light, the hardstands held 42 bombers. Ground crews moved between them in the dark, checking fuel loads, running through pre-flight inspections, testing control surface movement in the chill air. Flight crews arrived in trucks before dawn, their breath fogging in the October air, their conversation quieter than it had been earlier in the summer. They had seen what August had produced. They were not unaware of what the calendar and the weather and the lengthening routes were beginning to mean. The briefing officer pulled the curtain from the wall map, and the groan that went through the room was audible before he had spoken a single word. The red tape ran east, deep east, past the Rhine, into the heart of Germany. Schweinfurt, the ball-bearing plants that supplied nearly half of all the precision bearings in the German war machine. They had been there before, in August, when 60 bombers failed to return. They were going back. At the intelligence tables, the crews were given their expected losses. The planners had run the numbers and knew what the Luftwaffe would send up. The flak belts over the target were among the densest in Germany, and the distances involved placed the entire inbound and outbound route beyond the range of the fighter escorts that had been covering the formations on shorter missions. The figures were not encouraging. What the planners could not tell the crews, what no one in that briefing room yet understood, was that some of the aircraft that would fly to Schweinfurt that day would absorb punishment that the engineering manuals said was incompatible with continued flight. Engines would be shot away. Control surfaces would be reduced to metal ribbons. Hydraulic systems would bleed dry at altitude. Fuel would stream from tanks perforated by cannon fire. And some of those aircraft would bring their crews home anyway. What the German fighter pilots who attacked those formations would encounter was something that confused them and, in the testimonies that survive, continued to disturb them for years afterward. Not the volume of return fire, which they had long accounted for in their tactics. What shook them was watching B-17s they had already written off continue to fly. If this story is pulling you in, take a second to hit the like button and subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. It means a great deal to know who's listening. The Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress had been in development since 1934, when the Army Air Corps issued a request for a multi-engine bomber capable of carrying a significant bomb load over long distances at high altitude. Boeing's answer was a large aircraft, heavy for its time, with 4 Wright Cyclone radial engines, and a wing designed with a relatively thick cross-section that gave it structural reserve well beyond the minimum specification. The aircraft that reached operational service by 1942 had evolved considerably from that first prototype. The B-17F and the G model that followed were machines of considerable complexity. An empty G model weighed 36,000 pounds. Fully loaded for a deep penetration mission, it could approach 65,000 pounds. The airframe was built around a central spar structure, with longerons running the length of the fuselage and ribs forming the cross-section. The skin was stressed aluminum, riveted in panels, each panel contributing to the overall rigidity of the structure. Boeing's engineers had built in what the manuals described as redundancy. Redundancy in this context was not a theoretical comfort. It was engineering practice applied in steel and aluminum, arrived at through a design process that assumed the aircraft would be operated at the extremes of its performance envelope and would need to survive conditions that peacetime specifications could only approximate. The fuel system ran through multiple self-sealing tanks in the wings. The electrical system had backup circuits. The flight control cables ran dual paths where the geometry of the fuselage allowed it. For engines meant that the loss of one or two still left the aircraft capable of returning to base, provided the structural integrity of the wing remained, and provided the remaining engines were not asked to compensate for unmanageable aerodynamic damage elsewhere. The German fighter pilots who rose to meet the 8th Air Force formations over occupied Europe in 1943 understood all of this in principle. They had been briefed on the B-17's construction. They knew the fuel system was self-sealing, that the aircraft could absorb 20mm cannon rounds in non-critical areas and keep flying. The standard attack profiles developed by the Luftwaffe from late 1942 onward were designed to defeat this redundancy to put rounds into critical systems: the engines, the wing root fuel cells, the flight deck. Rammjager units experimented with head-on attacks, closing from 12 o'clock high at high relative speed, attempting to put cannon fire through the cockpit and forward fuselage where the structural members were concentrated and where a short burst could kill both pilots and sever the primary control run simultaneously. The tactic worked. It worked against bombers that were hid in the right place. What it could not account for was what happened when the right place was missed, when cannon rounds walked across a fuselage in a pattern that destroyed systems, tore open tanks, shredded control surfaces, killed crew members, and still the aircraft continued. Not because it was invulnerable, because Boeing's engineers had placed the critical paths where they were hardest to reach, and because the physics of a large aircraft at cruise altitude gave it a kind of inertia, a tendency to continue doing what it was already doing, that a smaller machine would not have possessed. The Schweinfurt mission of October 14th was the largest deep penetration raid the 8th Air Force had yet attempted without fighter escort beyond the penetration limit. 291 B-17s departed England that morning. The fighter escort, P-47s from the 456th and other groups, could accompany the formation only as far as Aachen. After that, the bombers flew alone for several hundred miles in each direction, through the densest concentrations of fighter opposition in the German air defense system. The Luftwaffe knew the route. German radar had tracked the formations from the English coast. By the time the fighters turned back at the penetration limit, a coordinated response was already in motion. Twin-engine fighters, Messerschmitt 110s and Junkers 88s equipped with air-to-air rockets and heavy cannon, positioned ahead of the formations to make frontal attacks. Single-engine fighters, 109s and 190s, climbed to altitude and waited for the formation to pass beneath them, then dove through the boxes firing and climbing away before the defensive guns could track them effectively. The attack began over Belgium and continued without significant pause for the 3 hours it took the formation to reach the target, bomb, and attempt to return. By the time the surviving aircraft crossed the German border on the return leg, 60 bombers had been lost, and 17 more had been so badly damaged that they never flew again. The 8th Air Force later classified this mission as the point at which it became clear that unescorted deep penetration was unsustainable at any loss rate a force of finite size could absorb over a sustained campaign. The figures were processed at High Wycombe, where 8th Air Force Headquarters maintained the operational records. The senior staff noted not only the number lost, but the number that had returned with damage severe enough to require grounding. When the two categories were combined, the effective loss rate on the mission exceeded 20% of the force that had departed. No organization conducting regular operations at that rate of attrition could maintain effective strength without a corresponding replacement program. And the replacement program, in the autumn of 1943, could not keep pace with losses of that magnitude for any sustained period. What the loss figures did not record was what happened to the bombers that came back. Aircraft mechanics at the English bases who handled the returning machines walked through fuselages in which daylight came through in beams where cannon rounds had punched clean through the aluminum skin. They found main spars cracked but not severed, hydraulic lines cut, so that brake fluid had drained away entirely, leaving the aircraft to be brought to a stop only by ground loops or crash barriers. They found oxygen systems destroyed, meaning crews had spent the return leg at altitude without supplemental oxygen, navigating by map and instinct in conditions that should have produced incapacitation. They found tail gunner positions destroyed and empty, the gunners either dead or missing. And they found fuel-soaked interiors where self-sealing tanks had been penetrated by fire of a caliber too large for the sealant to close entirely. On some aircraft, the wing tanks had drained through the holes before the sealant could function, and the crew had nursed engines running on reserve fuel from the target area home, across 300 miles of hostile sky. One aircraft that landed at Chelston had taken cannon hits in all 4 engine nacelles. 2 engines had been shut down over Germany. The other 2 were running rough, with oil pressure and one reading near the red line. The aircraft's vertical stabilizer was partially destroyed. The horizontal stabilizer on the left side had been holed in multiple places, and the elevator trim was locked in a slight nose-down attitude that the pilot had compensated for by holding back pressure on a yoke for 3 hours. He had landed the aircraft by feel, without trim, without brakes, without the rudder authority a properly built tail would have provided. The maintenance assessment that followed documented the extent of the structural damage. What it also documented, in equal measure, was what had not failed. The primary wing spar was intact. The main longerons were intact. The control cables had been damaged, but not severed. The aircraft had been flyable because the cannon rounds, distributed across the airframe by the angle of attack and the speed of closure, had found the expendable structure. They had not found the essential structure. The crew's debrief ran for 2 hours. The intelligence officers wanted every detail of the fighter attacks, the flak concentrations, the formation integrity over the target. The maintenance officers wanted to know the sequence of events that had brought the aircraft to that landing. The answer was partly the pilot's skill, partly the aircraft's construction, and partly the pattern of damage. The cannon rounds had missed the spars. They had missed the control runs. They had destroyed systems, killed one crew member, and filled the interior with the smell of hydraulic fluid and burned aluminum. But they had not found the places where a hit would have been fatal to the aircraft. If this is the kind of history you want more of, subscribe and turn on notifications. There's far more in the record still to cover. Your support is what keeps these stories coming. The German pilots who reported on the Schweinfurt mission and on the broader campaign against the bomber formations in 1943 were consistent in their observations across multiple debriefs and post-war accounts. Oberleutnant Egon Mayer, who had developed the head-on attack profile from his analysis of the defensive gun arcs, and who by that period commanded elements of the fighter defense on the Western Front, wrote in one of his assessments that the B-17's structural tolerance exceeded anything the German fighter community had anticipated from the pre-war specifications available to them. His specific observation concerned the wing. Mayer noted that aircraft his pilots had reported as burning from wing hits had continued to fly for periods that, in his judgment, should not have been possible given the extent of the damage visible from attack range. He attributed this partly to the self-sealing tanks, but acknowledged that the tanks alone did not explain what he was observing. What Mayer was observing was the consequence of a design philosophy that Boeing had applied consistently from the beginning of the B-17's development. The wing had been built with structural reserve, meaning it had been designed to carry loads considerably heavier than it would typically be asked to carry in normal operations. The spar caps were sized for the maximum anticipated gross weight, with a safety factor applied beyond that. A spar cap that could carry 100% of the required load would, if partially compromised by battle damage, still carry a significant fraction of that load. An aircraft whose wing load was reduced because fuel was streaming from the tanks and the bomb load had been dropped over the target weighed less than it had on the inbound leg. The damaged spar was being asked to carry a lighter aircraft than the aircraft it had been designed for. This is not a paradox. It is applied engineering, observable in practice by anyone with access to the loading figures and the structural calculations. The crews did not know this calculation. The German fighter pilots did not know it. What they experienced in practice was a bomber that continued to fly when visible evidence suggested it should not. The airframes that came back to England in the worst condition were taken to modification centers where engineers cut sections of the structure open to examine what had happened inside. The reports from those inspections described main spar caps that had been nicked by fragments and continued to carry load because the remaining cross-section was sufficient. They described longerons bent but not broken, their material still carrying tension and compression along the fuselage. They described control cables that had been frayed by fragments, reduced to a fraction of their original braking strength, but still intact enough to transmit the pilot's inputs with enough fidelity to keep the aircraft in controlled flight. The phenomenon was not universal, and it was not guaranteed. 60 aircraft had not made it back from Schweinfurt. Many of them had gone down because the damage had in fact found the critical paths, because the cannon rounds had entered the wing root at an angle that destroyed the primary structure, because the flight deck had taken a burst that killed the pilots before control could be transferred. The aircraft that came back were not proof that the B-17 was indestructible. They were proof that the margins built into its construction were large enough that significant damage could be absorbed without that damage crossing every critical threshold simultaneously. The crew of a B-17 flying with the 351st Bomb Group had 3 engines destroyed on the inbound leg to Schweinfurt and lost a 4th over the target. They flew without engine power from the target area, descending in a controlled glide, trading altitude for distance toward the English coast. A 4-engine aircraft flying without power at altitude is not an aircraft in level flight. It is an aircraft trading altitude for distance, descending at a rate determined by the lift-to-drag ratio of the airframe. The B-17's wing, with its thick profile and large area, produced a relatively favorable glide ratio for an aircraft of its weight. The crew bailed out near the English coast because the aircraft, even without power, had covered a distance that kept most of them within range of rescue. The German pilots who watched B-17s go into these configurations, trailing smoke, with engines feathered, descending away from the formation, and then failing to fall out of the sky in the manner their training predicted, were observing the same physics. The aircraft did not stop flying simply because it had lost power. It continued to descend in a controlled manner for as long as there was a pilot to hold the controls, and as long as the structural damage had not destroyed the wing or the tail. Some pilots in the Luftwaffe debriefings expressed frustration with the confirmation requirements for victory claims. The standard procedure required visual confirmation of a destruction, meaning the aircraft had to be seen to disintegrate, catch fire, or be observed hitting the ground or sea. An aircraft that descended away from the formation trailing smoke, with the crew apparently intact, might or might not have reached home. Some did. The German pilots could not always know which outcome had occurred, and so their claims in some cases could not be confirmed until the mission records were compared decades later. The maintenance records from the 8th Air Force bases in England are detailed enough to track individual aircraft through multiple missions. The record of one B-17 flying with the 91st Bomb Group at Bassingbourn shows her returning from 7 consecutive missions with battle damage logged each time. The damage ranged from flak holes in the fuselage skin, repaired by riveting aluminum patches over the holes, to cannon damage to the right horizontal stabilizer requiring 2 engine changes after one particular mission. The aircraft was back on operations within 11 days. The aircraft's crew changed more frequently than the aircraft itself. Individual crew members rotated out through wounds, through completed tours, through the statistical toll of missions over Germany. The aircraft accumulated damage and was repaired and accumulated damage again. The repair patches were visible on the skin, the aluminum slightly shinier where it was new, the rivet heads slightly different in their spacing. An aircraft that had flown 20 missions over Germany wore its history in those patches, each one a record of what the structure had survived and what the mechanics had restored. The mechanics who maintained these aircraft developed an intimate knowledge of the B-17's construction through the process of repairing it. They knew where the structure was thick and where it was thin. They knew which areas of damage could be addressed with a patch and a few hours of work, and which required depot-level repair or the replacement of major assemblies. Their knowledge was not theoretical. It came from cutting open damaged fuselages and wings and seeing what was inside, from handling the pieces of structure that had held and the pieces that had failed, from knowing both categories well enough to tell one from the other in the dark. The group of men at Charleston who worked on the most severely damaged aircraft returning from Schweinfurt spent 3 days conducting their own informal survey before the depot engineers arrived. They cataloged the hits by location, measured the distances between penetrations, sketched the angles of entry. Their survey was not commissioned. It was not part of any official program. They did it because they wanted to understand what they were looking at. Their findings matched what the depot engineers later confirmed in formal analysis. The aircraft had absorbed a statistically unlikely pattern of damage. The rounds had found the non-essential structure consistently and had missed the essential structure almost entirely. Whether this was the geometry of the attack angle, the distribution of the defensive fire, the speed of the aircraft relative to the attacker, or simply probability working in the crew's favor, could not be determined from the wreckage alone. What could be determined was that the structure that had been designed to carry the aircraft had carried it. The German fighter pilots attacking these aircraft had no equivalent access to that information. They were working from brief specifications and from the observable behavior of aircraft under attack. The observable behavior in many cases defied their expectations. German pilots who flew against the formations across 1943 described in post-war accounts the practical problem of attacking a B-17 that was already trailing smoke from one engine, firing 2 sustained bursts with cannon and machine guns into the fuselage and wing root, and then watching the aircraft continue in formation for several more minutes before it finally began to descend. Their reflections attributed this partly to the attack distances, which were often greater than ideal due to the defensive fire from the formation. At closer range, the assessment ran consistently through multiple accounts. The structural damage would have been decisive more quickly. They were probably correct. The defensive armament of the B-17, 13 50 caliber machine guns in the G model, made sustained close-range attack expensive in aircraft and pilots. The geometry of the formation, with aircraft staggered in altitude and lateral position, meant that an attacker approaching one bomber was exposed to fire from several others simultaneously. The Luftwaffe's response to this, the head-on attack, and the use of rockets and heavy cannon fired from outside the effective range of the defensive guns, was tactically sound but placed the attacker in a less favorable position for delivering damage to the critical structural points of the target. The wing spar ran through the fuselage at a point that was covered by the defensive gun arcs above and below the aircraft. The flight deck was armored and was also the area most likely to receive suppressive fire from the nose guns as an attacker closed from the front. The result was a machine that could be damaged extensively in areas that were not critical, that could absorb that damage and continue to function, while its most critical components remained difficult to destroy cleanly in a single attack pass. After Schweinfurt, the 8th Air Force suspended deep penetration missions pending the arrival of the P-51 Mustang as a long-range escort fighter. The losses were not sustainable at any rate a force of finite size could absorb over a sustained campaign. But the aircraft that had flown those missions and the maintenance records they generated fed into a continuous process of modification. Armor was added to vulnerable areas identified for battle damage analysis. Self-sealing fuel tanks were upgraded based on the calibers that had proved effective in penetrating them. Crew positions were adjusted based on where casualties had been highest. The aircraft that flew the later missions of 1944, when the escort fighters finally had the range to accompany the formations to Berlin and back, were not the same aircraft that had flown in the autumn of 1943. They were heavier, better protected, and operating in a tactical environment that had changed because the long-range escort had changed the fundamental conditions of the fight. What remained constant through those changes was the fundamental structural design that Boeing had committed to in the 1930s. The wing that carried a B-17 to Berlin in 1944 was built to the same primary structural principles as the wing that had carried the aircraft over Schweinfurt in 1943. The spar caps that had proved in practice to carry load well beyond the point at which the aircraft appeared to the German pilots to be capable of flight were still doing the same work. Some of the B-17s that flew in the final months of the war had frames that had been in service since 1942. They had been repaired and modified, had engines replaced and instruments updated, but the basic structure was original. Those aircraft carried the evidence of their construction in the patches on their skin and the repaired frames inside their fuselages. The aircraft did not survive the war as preserved artifacts. Surplus military aircraft were not maintained in any systematic way in the late 1940s. Most were scrapped, the aluminum melted down. The small number that survived into civilian hands, and the smaller number still that were eventually placed in museums or restored to flying condition, carry the physical record of that construction in their rivet patterns and their original spar sections. The B-17G on display at the National Museum of the United States Air Force at Wright-Patterson, and the two airworthy examples maintained by private organizations that still fly at air shows, are among the few surviving witnesses to what the aircraft construction meant in practice. Mechanics who work on those aircraft today describe finding original structural members alongside repair work done at wartime modification centers. The two generations of aluminum and steel fasteners separated by decades, but telling the same story about what the design had been asked to do and what it had been able to deliver. The engineers who come to examine them are working from original Boeing drawings that confirm what the maintenance crews in England observed in practice. The structure was built with margins that the pre-war procurement specifications had not required, and that only the test of sustained combat revealed as having been correct. The German pilots who survived the war and who wrote or spoke about their experience attacking the B-17 formations returned consistently to the same observation. The aircraft was harder to bring down than it should have been. The aircraft's construction was not what they had anticipated from the available specifications. The bomber formations continued to fly over Germany after losses that should, by any reasonable calculation, have broken the campaign. They continued to fly because the aircraft that were hit many of them, flew home. They flew home because Boeing had built a machine with more structure than the minimum, more redundancy than was strictly required, more tolerance for damage than the attack profiles developed against it had been designed to defeat. The record of that is in the maintenance logs held at the National Archives. It is in the battle damage assessments that the 8th Air Force compiled from the aircraft that returned. It is in the debriefing reports of German pilots, trying to explain to their intelligence officers why a bomber they had fired into for several seconds was still in the air. It is in the aircraft themselves, the few that remain, where the original spar sections and the repair patches together tell the story of a machine tested far beyond its design envelope and found, most of the time, to have been built well enough to survive it. Thank you for staying with us until the end. If what you heard here stayed with you, the other films on your screen carry the story forward. Subscribe if you haven't, and I'll see you in the next one.